Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1843, when a peculiar series of events began to unfold in Savannah's historic district. Events that would remain shrouded in whispers for over a century. Savannah, with its Spanish moss hanging like frozen memories from ancient oaks, was already considered one of the most haunted cities in America, though what transpired at the Crowell residence on East Broughton Street had nothing to do with the supernatural. The true horror, as investigators would later discover, was entirely human. The Crowell household stood 3 stories tall, a testament to wealth accumulated through the cotton trade and, more significantly, through the brutal institution of slavery that defined the American South. Elijah Crowell was a respected businessman whose name appeared in local newspapers whenever charitable contributions were made to the city's various institutions. His wife, Mary Ann Dupree Crowell, was known for hosting elaborate gatherings where Savannah's elite would discuss politics, trade, and the growing tensions between North and South. To the outside observer, the Crowells represented Southern aristocracy at its finest, cultured, refined, and deeply committed to what they called their traditional way of life. According to the Chatham County Records Office, the Crowell plantation employed over 70 enslaved persons, 30 of whom worked within the household itself. The others tended to the sprawling cotton fields that stretched beyond the city limits. It was a system built on human suffering, though at the time such arrangements were not only common, but celebrated as the foundation of Southern prosperity. What distinguished the Crowell household, however, was not the number of people they enslaved, but the unusual disappearances that began to occur under their roof. The first to vanish was a man identified in property records only as Thomas, age approximately 31. According to a journal kept by the household manager, Thomas failed to appear for his duties on the morning of April 16, 1843. The initial assumption was that he had attempted to escape, a common enough occurrence in the antebellum South that entire industries had developed around the capture and return of those seeking freedom. The usual procedures were followed. Notifications were sent to neighboring plantations, advertisements were placed in the Savannah Republican newspaper, and bounty hunters were commissioned to search the surrounding marshlands and forests. But Thomas was never found. Not a single trace, no footprints leading into the wilderness, no sightings along known escape routes to the north, no body discovered in the treacherous swamps that surrounded the city. He had simply ceased to exist. Under normal circumstances, such a disappearance would have been notable primarily for the financial loss it represented to the slave owner. But what followed in the Crowell household transformed this initial vanishing into something far more disturbing. Within 6 weeks, 3 more individuals disappeared from the property, 2 women identified in records as Sarah and Elizabeth, and another man known as William. All vanished without taking any belongings, without leaving any signs of escape, and, most puzzlingly, without any of the other enslaved persons reporting any knowledge of their plans or whereabouts. The Savannah city authorities became involved after the 4th disappearance, though not out of concern for the missing individuals. Rather, the fear was that some form of organized rebellion might be developing. This was less than a decade after the Nat Turner Rebellion had sent shockwaves through the South, and any unusual behavior among enslaved populations was treated as a potential security threat. Captain James Hartridge of the Savannah Police Department was assigned to investigate. His initial report, dated June 12, 1843, noted, "The Crowell residence appears secure, with no evidence of forced departure. The remaining servants expressed genuine confusion regarding the whereabouts of their missing companions. Mr. Crowell maintains strict oversight of his property and expresses particular distress over these losses. What Captain Hartridge didn't include in his official report, but later confided in private correspondence to his brother in Charleston, was his impression of Mary Ann Dupree Crowell. "There is something in the lady's demeanor that unsettles me greatly," he wrote. "She speaks of the missing slaves with unusual detachment, referring to them as if they were misplaced items rather than human property. When I inquired about the most recent disappearance, she smiled in a manner I can only describe as inappropriate to the circumstances. The investigation might have ended there, filed away as an unsolved case of escaped slaves, had it not been for the sudden illness that struck Elijah Crowell in late July of that same year. According to the medical report filed by Dr. William Bullock, Crowell began experiencing severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and gradual weakness that confined him to his bed. His condition deteriorated over a period of 2 weeks, with symptoms that baffled the physicians called to his bedside. In his private medical journal, Dr. Bullock noted his suspicions. "The symptoms present in Mr. Crowell bear resemblance to those of arsenic poisoning, though I have no evidence to suggest such foul play. Mrs. Crowell attends to him diligently, preparing his meals herself and refusing to allow the house servants to administer his medicines. Elijah Crowell died on August 11, 1843. His death was officially attributed to gastric inflammation of unknown origin, and he was buried with full honors in Bonaventure Cemetery. The funeral was attended by Savannah's most prominent citizens, with Mary Ann Dupree Crowell dressed in black, her face concealed behind a heavy veil throughout the ceremony. With Elijah's death, ownership of the plantation and all its assets, including the enslaved persons, transferred to his widow. It was unusual for a woman to manage such extensive properties alone, but Mary Ann quickly demonstrated a surprising aptitude for business. Within months, she had reorganized the plantation operations, dismissed several overseers hired by her late husband, and implemented new protocols for the household staff. It was during this period of transition that the disappearances resumed. Between September 1843 and February 1844, 7 more individuals vanished from the Crowell property. Unlike the earlier cases, these disappearances attracted little official attention. Mary Ann reported them to the authorities as required by law, but her influence in the community and generous donations to the Police Benevolent Fund ensured that investigations remained cursory at best. What might have continued indefinitely as an unexplained series of disappearances was interrupted by the arrival of Jacob Pearson, Elijah Crowell's cousin from Philadelphia. Pearson, who had inherited a minor share in the Crowell business interests, traveled to Savannah in March 1844 to discuss his portion of the estate. He was a Northerner with increasingly abolitionist leanings, though he had maintained contact with his Southern relatives out of family loyalty and financial interest. According to his personal diary, discovered decades later in a Philadelphia archive, Pearson was immediately struck by the atmosphere of the Crowell household. "There hangs about the place a palpable dread," he wrote on March 23rd. "The servants move through their duties like somnambulists, speaking only when directly addressed and avoiding all eye contact. When I inquired after certain individuals whom I recalled from my previous visit 3 years ago, my questions were met with silence and averted gazes. Cousin Mary Ann explained that there had been a number of runaways, though she seemed unconcerned by these substantial losses to her property. Pearson's suspicions grew during his 2-week stay. He noted the strange sounds that emanated from the cellar during the night, sounds that Mary Ann attributed to settling of the foundation when he mentioned them at breakfast. He observed how the household staff would not enter certain rooms without explicit permission, and how they would sometimes freeze at the sound of Mary Ann's footsteps in the hallway. Most disturbing was his account of an encounter with an elderly enslaved woman named Ruth, who had been with the Crowell family for over 40 years. Finding her alone in the kitchen garden one afternoon, Pearson attempted to engage her in conversation about the missing individuals. According to his diary, Ruth initially refused to speak, but when Pearson pressed her, she whispered, "Don't ask about them, sir. Don't ever ask about them. And don't take food or drink from the mistress's hand." Before she could elaborate, Mary Ann appeared in the garden, and Ruth immediately returned to her work, hands trembling as she pulled weeds from between the herb plants. That night, Ruth disappeared. Mary Ann informed Pearson at breakfast that the elderly woman had run off in the night, an explanation he found implausible given Ruth's age and lifelong attachment to the property. His diary entry for that day reads, "I am now convinced that something monstrous occurs in this house. I can no longer in good conscience remain under this roof, but neither can I leave without attempting to discover the truth of these disappearances." What Pearson did next would eventually lead to the partial unraveling of the mystery. Rather than confronting Mary Ann directly, he feigned an urgent business matter in the city and took a room at the Pulaski Hotel. From there, he contacted Captain Hartridge, who had conducted the initial investigation the previous year. Though Hartridge was reluctant to reopen the case based solely on the suspicions of a northern visitor, Pearson's status as a blood relative of Elijah Crowell lent him credibility. Together, they devised a plan. Pearson would return to the Crowell residence and announce his intention to stay for another week. During this time, Hartridge would assign an officer to secretly observe the property, particularly at night. Pearson would also attempt to gain access to areas of the house normally kept locked, including the cellar that was the source of the mysterious sounds. Pearson returned to the Crowell house on April 2nd, 1844. Mary Ann received him cordially enough, though he noted in his diary that her eyes betray calculation behind every smile. He informed her of his extended stay, citing complications with the estate paperwork that required his presence in Savannah. She offered no objection, though she mentioned that she would be hosting a dinner for several business associates in 2 days' time and expected him to attend. The following night, while Mary Ann was attending a concert at St. John's Episcopal Church, Pearson attempted to explore the cellar. His diary describes his findings. The main cellar contains nothing unusual, merely the expected storage for wines, preserved foods, and household supplies. However, I discovered that the rear wall, behind a stack of old furniture, bears evidence of recent masonry work. A section approximately 6 feet wide appears to have been sealed with new bricks, though efforts have been made to age the surface with dirt and cobwebs. I am now certain that there exists a hidden chamber beyond this wall, and equally certain that I must discover what it contains. Before Pearson could continue his investigation, he was interrupted by the return of Mary Ann from the concert. In his haste to exit the cellar undetected, he left behind a monogrammed handkerchief, a mistake that would prove fatal. At dinner the following evening, Mary Ann was particularly attentive to her cousin by marriage, ensuring that his glass was always full and personally serving him from each dish. Pearson, aware of her scrutiny, pretended to eat and drink while actually disposing of much of what she served him. Even so, he reported feeling increasingly unwell as the evening progressed. By the time the guests departed, Pearson was experiencing symptoms similar to those described in Elijah Crowell's final illness: abdominal pain, nausea, and growing weakness. Suspecting poison, he excused himself and returned to his room, where he attempted to induce vomiting. His diary entry, written in an increasingly unsteady hand, reads, "I have been undone by my own carelessness. The handkerchief has betrayed me, and now I taste the same fate that I believe befell cousin Elijah. I have written a full account of my suspicions and investigations, which I shall entrust to my valet with instructions to deliver it to Captain H. should I not survive the night. Jacob Pearson died before morning. The official cause was recorded as acute gastric distress, possibly due to consumption of tainted seafood. A diagnosis supported by the fact that several other dinner guests reported mild digestive discomfort the following day. Mary Ann Dupree Crowell expressed appropriate grief at this second tragedy to befall her household within a year. The letter that Pearson had entrusted to his valet never reached Captain Hartridge. The valet himself disappeared the day after his master's funeral, along with all of Pearson's personal effects, including his diary. Mary Ann explained to authorities that the man had been paid his due wages and had departed for Philadelphia to inform Pearson's family of his death personally. No record exists of his arrival in Philadelphia or anywhere else. The story might have ended there, another inexplicable chapter in Savannah's history, had it not been for a severe storm that struck the city in 1868, more than 20 years later. The hurricane caused significant damage throughout Savannah, including structural failure of several historic buildings. Among them was the old Crowell residence, by then owned by a shipping merchant named George Harmon, who had purchased it following Mary Ann Dupree Crowell's death in 1859. During reconstruction of the damaged cellar, workers discovered the hidden chamber that Jacob Pearson had suspected. What they found inside was documented in a police report dated October 12, 1868. Behind the concealed wall, a room measuring approximately 15 feet square. Within this space were discovered human remains, representing an estimated 12 to 15 individuals of varying ages and both sexes. The remains show evidence of having been subjected to preservation attempts similar to those used in medical studies. Several specimens appear to have been dissected in a methodical fashion. The discovery sent shockwaves through Savannah society. How could such atrocities have occurred in the heart of the city's most respectable neighborhood? And who could have been responsible? The answer lay in a small leather-bound journal found among Mary Ann Dupree Crowell's personal papers, which had been stored in the attic of the house and largely forgotten after her death. The journal, spanning the years 1842 to 1859, revealed a mind of extraordinary scientific curiosity coupled with complete moral detachment. Mary Ann, it seemed, had developed an interest in human anatomy during her youth in Paris, where her father had served as a diplomat. Though women were excluded from formal medical education, she had managed to attend a series of lectures by secretly dressing as a young man. Her fascination with the human body, particularly with the physiological differences between races, had grown into an obsession by the time she married Elijah Crowell and moved to Savannah. In the journal, she documented her studies in clinical detail. The individuals who had disappeared from the Crowell household had not escaped. They had been selected for Mary Ann's private anatomical investigations. She described administering various sedatives to render them unconscious before moving them to her hidden laboratory. There, she conducted dissections and experimental surgeries, meticulously recording her observations on what she called the Negro physiology. Perhaps most disturbing were her notes on poison experiments, where she tested various toxic substances to observe their effects. Elijah, it became clear, had not been her first poisoning victim, but rather the culmination of a series of trials conducted on enslaved individuals. When he began to question the disappearances on the plantation, she turned her methods against him, administering small doses of arsenic over several weeks to simulate a natural illness. Jacob Pearson's death followed the same pattern after he had come too close to discovering her secret work. The journal entry regarding his death was particularly chilling. Cousin Jacob proved more resilient than expected, perhaps due to his partial avoidance of the tainted wine. Nevertheless, the outcome was satisfactory. His northern sensibilities would have prevented a proper understanding of my scientific contributions. The authorities of 1868, faced with these revelations about crimes committed decades earlier by a woman long dead, chose to handle the matter quietly. The remains discovered in the cellar were buried without ceremony in an unmarked section of Laurel Grove Cemetery. Mary Ann's journal was initially placed in police archives, but later vanished, presumably destroyed or removed by someone with connections to the families mentioned in its pages. For nearly a century, the story remained buried, occasionally emerging in whispered conversations, but never fully acknowledged in Savannah's official history. It wasn't until 1952 that historian Margaret Walton, researching a book on unusual crimes in Georgia's past, uncovered enough corroborating evidence to piece together the basic outline of what had occurred at the Crowell residence. Even then, her published account was heavily redacted, with names changed and the most disturbing details omitted. The full horror of Mary Ann Dupree Crowell's actions only came to light in 1967, when renovations to the old police headquarters uncovered a sealed box containing Captain Hartridge's personal papers. Among them was a copy of the missing journal that he had made before the original disappeared, along with his own extensive notes on the case, including his regret at not having pursued the investigation more vigorously after the first disappearances. Today, the building that once housed the Crowell residence still stands on East Broughton Street, though it has been divided into apartments and retail spaces. Most of the current occupants know nothing of the horrors that once transpired within those walls. But occasionally, new tenants report unusual sounds coming from the sealed areas of the old cellar, sounds they describe as like someone scratching, very faintly, against brick. Historians and crime researchers who have studied the case suggest that Mary Ann Dupree Crowell may have been one of America's earliest documented serial killers, her activities predating more famous cases by decades. What makes her case particularly notable is not just the number of victims, but the calculated scientific approach she brought to her crimes. In 1859, Mary Ann died in her sleep at the age of 63. By all accounts, a peaceful death for a woman who had inflicted such suffering on others. The doctor who signed her death certificate noted no suspicious circumstances. She was buried next to her husband in Bonaventure Cemetery, her tombstone bearing the inscription, "A woman of rare intellect and refinement." The mystery of what drove Mary Ann Dupree Crowell to commit such atrocities remains unsolved. Was it mere scientific curiosity, unrestrained by moral considerations? Was there some deeper psychological disturbance, perhaps stemming from her unconventional upbringing in European diplomatic circles? Or was it something more sinister, a fundamental belief in her right to treat other human beings as mere specimens for study? What is certain is that the story of the Crowell residence represents one of the darkest chapters in Savannah's long and often troubled history. It stands as a reminder that true horror rarely involves supernatural elements, but rather the depths to which human cruelty can descend when empathy is absent and power goes unchecked. In 1968, the last known copy of Mary Ann's journal was reportedly sealed in university archives, deemed too disturbing for public access. The historian who last examined it before its sequestration wrote, "What strikes the reader is not just the detailed accounts of anatomical procedures, but the complete absence of any recognition that her subjects were human beings. They are described throughout solely in terms of specimens, with reference numbers rather than names. It is perhaps the most complete documentation of the dehumanizing effects of the slave system that I have encountered in 30 years of historical research." Visitors to Savannah who tour the historic district walk past the former Crowell residence without a second glance. There is no historical marker, no indication of the horrors that once unfolded behind its elegant facade. The tour guides who lead ghost walks through the city rarely mention Mary Ann Dupree Crowell, focusing instead on more palatable legends and romantic haunting stories. But in certain academic circles, the case continues to be studied as an example of how historical atrocities can be concealed within the very structures we preserve and celebrate. The architecture that we admire for its beauty often contains dark secrets, reminders that the past we choose to remember is seldom the complete truth. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story is how effectively it was suppressed for so long. The complicity of Savannah's 19th-century elite in burying the truth speaks to a collective unwillingness to confront the darkest aspects of their society. Even today, some descendants of families mentioned in Mary Ann's journal prefer that the story remain untold. But history has a way of revealing itself, one fragment at a time. Like the hidden chamber in the Crowell cellar, eventually exposed by forces beyond human control, the truth emerges despite our efforts to conceal it. And when it does, we are forced to confront not just the specific horrors of one woman's actions, but the broader system that enabled her to commit them with impunity for so many years. The legacy of the Crowell case extends beyond its historical significance. It raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember the past, which stories we choose to tell, and which ones we prefer to forget. It challenges us to look more critically at the elegant buildings and charming streets of cities like Savannah, to recognize that behind their beauty often lie histories of exploitation and violence. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of the Crowell mystery is not what happened within those walls, but how easily it might have remained forever unknown. How many similar stories may still lie buried beneath the carefully preserved facades of our historic districts, waiting for a storm, a renovation, or a persistent researcher to bring them to light. For those who walk Savannah's streets today, particularly as evening falls and shadows lengthen across the cobblestones, the elegant buildings take on a different aspect when one knows what secrets they might contain. Not ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but the very real horrors of human history, reminders that the most disturbing monsters are not the fictional creatures of our imagination, but the men and women who move among us, their monstrous actions concealed behind masks of respectability. In 1956, a graduate student named Thomas Mercer discovered several letters written by Mary Ann to a French physician, Dr. Henri Beaumont, with whom she had apparently maintained correspondence for years. The letters, found in an archive in Paris, contained veiled references to her private research and requests for specialized medical instruments not commonly available in America at that time. Dr. Beaumont's replies suggest he believed she was conducting legitimate scientific work, perhaps unaware of her methods or the identity of her subjects. One particular letter, dated September 1846, provides a rare glimpse into Mary Ann's mindset. The limitations placed upon women of scientific inclination are intolerable, while men of lesser intellect publish their mediocre findings to acclaim. I must conduct my superior studies in secrecy. Nevertheless, I have made remarkable observations on the internal structures of the Negro brain compared to those previously documented in European subjects. The differences, while subtle, are precisely where I had theorized they might be found. The letter continues with technical descriptions that Mercer, not being medically trained, could not fully interpret. He noted in his research journal that he had forwarded copies to a pathologist for review, but no record exists of this consultation or its findings. Mercer's research notes end abruptly in December 1956, with a brief entry stating that he had been advised by his academic supervisor to pursue more suitable topics for a promising young historian. The letters he discovered were subsequently removed from the Paris archive, their current whereabouts unknown. In 1963, during renovations to Bonaventure Cemetery, workers disturbed the Crowell family plot while installing new drainage systems. According to the maintenance log, when Mary Ann's coffin was accidentally damaged, cemetery workers made an unusual discovery. The coffin contained only rocks and sand, approximately equivalent to the weight of a human body. No remains were present. This discovery was not publicized, and the damaged coffin was quickly resealed and reburied with minimal documentation. The cemetery supervisor who recorded the incident in the maintenance log was replaced the following month, and subsequent editions of the cemetery records contain no mention of the event. This peculiar finding has led to speculation among the few historians familiar with the case. Had Mary Ann anticipated her eventual exposure and arranged for her own disappearance, perhaps faking her death in 1859? There are no reliable records of her being seen after that date, but neither is there any conclusive evidence that the body buried in Bonaventure Cemetery was not hers. The mystery of her final fate remains unresolved. In 1857, 2 years before her reported death, Mary Ann sold most of her property in Savannah and converted a significant portion of her wealth to portable assets, primarily gold and jewelry. According to bank records discovered in 1969, she withdrew virtually all her remaining funds in the week preceding her death. The executor of her estate, attorney William Sheffield, reported finding only modest sums in her personal accounts, though her will suggested she had anticipated leaving a much larger fortune. Sheffield's personal correspondence, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, reveals his confusion. "I cannot account for the disparity between what Mrs. Crowell led me to believe would be the value of her estate and what has actually been discovered. It is as if a great portion of her wealth simply vanished in the weeks before her passing." No investigation into this discrepancy was ever conducted, as the remaining assets were sufficient to satisfy the limited bequests specified in her will, primarily donations to various scientific institutions in Europe. Another curious document emerged in 1965, a passenger manifest from the steamship Carolina, which departed Savannah for Liverpool on April 23, 1859, just 3 days after Mary Ann Dupree Crowell was supposedly interred at Bonaventure Cemetery. The manifest lists a passenger named Marie Dupont, a widow traveling alone, who paid for her passage with gold coin. The physical description provided for customs purposes bears a striking resemblance to Mary Ann, a woman of approximately 60 years, 5 feet 4 inches tall, with grey hair and notably piercing blue eyes. British customs records show that Marie Dupont arrived in Liverpool on May 12, 1859, but no further record of her movements in England has been discovered. However, a Marie Dupont matching the same description appears in the guest registry of a small hotel in Paris in June of that year. The register indicates she stayed for only 1 week before departing for an unspecified destination. A final tantalizing clue appeared in 1967 when a collector of rare medical texts purchased a set of anatomical journals at an estate sale in Geneva, Switzerland. Among them was a handwritten manuscript entitled Comparative Studies of Human Physiognomy, authored by M.D.C., and dated 1862, 3 years after Mary Ann's supposed death. The manuscript contains detailed anatomical drawings and observations consistent with the methodologies described in Mary Ann's Savannah journal, though focusing on differences between European ethnic groups rather than racial comparisons. The manuscript was examined by experts familiar with the Crowell case, who confirmed significant similarities in handwriting and scientific notation style. However, without the original Savannah journal for direct comparison, no definitive conclusion could be reached regarding its authorship. The manuscript remains in a private collection, its owner reluctant to allow further scientific analysis for fear of diminishing its value. If Mary Ann Dupree Crowell did indeed fake her death and escape to Europe, she would have been in her mid-60s when the Geneva manuscript was written, elderly but certainly capable of continuing her studies. No record exists of a woman matching her description dying in Switzerland or neighboring countries in the subsequent decade, leaving open the possibility that she may have moved again, perhaps adopting yet another identity. The final documented reference to anyone who might have been Mary Ann comes from a letter written by a professor of medicine at the University of Vienna in 1868. He mentions consulting with an elderly American lady of exceptional anatomical knowledge who had provided valuable insights for his research. He describes her as somewhat secretive about her background, but possessing a first-hand familiarity with comparative anatomy that could only have been acquired through extensive practical experience. The professor's correspondence does not mention the lady's name, and no further references to her appear in his subsequent writings. As for the Crowell residence in Savannah, its history took another dark turn in 1969. A young couple who had purchased one of the apartments in the subdivided building began renovations to expand their kitchen. Behind a section of wall that had been added during earlier modifications, they discovered a small space containing a child's shoe, several human teeth, and a glass jar holding what appeared to be preserved human tissue. Police were called, but with no way to determine when the items had been placed there or by whom, the investigation was quickly closed. The couple sold the apartment shortly thereafter, reporting that they could no longer feel comfortable in the space, knowing what had been concealed within its walls. Since then, the building has changed hands multiple times, with various businesses occupying the ground floor and apartments above. Current owners report no unusual occurrences, though few of them are aware of the property's history. The sealed section of the cellar where Mary Ann conducted her gruesome experiments remains inaccessible, the entrance having been concealed during mid-20th century renovations. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that Mary Ann Dupree Crowell was not merely an anomaly, a lone monster operating in isolation, but rather an extreme manifestation of attitudes that pervaded the society in which she lived. Her scientific justifications for atrocity echoed the pseudo-scientific racism that many respected academics of her era promoted. Her exploitation of enslaved people for her own purposes, while unusually brutal, was an extension of a system that already denied their humanity. The ease with which she navigated Savannah society, maintaining a reputation as a refined and educated widow while conducting horrific experiments in her cellar, speaks to the willful blindness of those around her. How many servants or slaves vanished from Southern households, their disappearances noted only as financial losses in ledger books? How many deaths were attributed to natural causes without question or investigation? The Crowell case provides a glimpse into these darker questions, suggesting that what we know of historical atrocities may be only the surface of much deeper horrors. In 2003, an archaeological survey conducted near the former Crowell plantation outside Savannah discovered a series of unmarked graves containing the remains of approximately 20 individuals. Forensic analysis indicated that the burials dated to the mid-19th century and were consistent with enslaved persons from that period. Most significantly, several of the skeletal remains showed evidence of precise post-mortem cutting marks consistent with surgical tools rather than agricultural accidents or violent trauma. While it cannot be proven conclusively that these were additional victims of Mary Ann's research, the circumstantial evidence is compelling. The archaeologist who led the survey, Dr. Rebecca Johnson, noted in her report, "These remains tell a story of suffering that goes beyond the already terrible conditions of slavery. The post-mortem modifications suggest an almost clinical approach to the human body, devoid of any respect for the deceased. It represents a level of dehumanization that is disturbing, even within the context of an already dehumanizing institution. The remains were reinterred with appropriate ceremony in 2004, with representatives from several African American churches in Savannah in attendance. A simple stone marker now stands at the site, reading only, "Here rest the unnamed." Their humanity denied in life, we honor it in remembrance. For modern visitors to Savannah, the story of Mary Ann Dupree Crowell and the Crowell residence serves as a reminder that historical sites are not merely picturesque backdrops for vacation photographs. They are spaces where real human dramas, sometimes horrific ones, played out. The elegant facades of Savannah's historic district conceal countless stories, many of them lost to time or deliberately suppressed. When the evening fog rolls in from the Savannah River, shrouding the old buildings in mist, it's easy to imagine how secrets could have been kept in this city of shadows. The muffled footsteps on cobblestone streets, the whispers behind shuttered windows, the silent passage of keys from hand to hand, all elements of a society built on discretion and appearances. Mary Ann Dupree Crowell understood this society perfectly and exploited its conventions to conceal her activities. Her position as a wealthy widow granted her unusual independence for a woman of her era. Her reputation for intellectual pursuits, while considered somewhat eccentric, remained within the bounds of what her social circle would tolerate. And her victims were people whose disappearances would raise minimal concern among those with the power to investigate. It was a perfect storm of privilege, opportunity, and calculated cruelty, a combination that allowed her to operate undetected for years and possibly to escape justice entirely through her carefully planned disappearance. If she did indeed flee to Europe to continue her studies, she would have lived out her remaining years in comfort, never facing any consequences for the lives she destroyed. The file on the Crowell case was officially closed by the Savannah Police Department in 1968, deemed too old to warrant further investigation. The few remaining documents related to the case were transferred to the Georgia Historical Society, where they remain accessible to researchers with appropriate academic credentials. Public access is restricted, ostensibly to protect the privacy of descendants of those mentioned in the records. Every October, around the anniversary of the discovery of the hidden chamber, a small bouquet of white lilies appears on the steps of the former Crowell residence. No one has ever observed who places them there, and the current occupants of the building report no knowledge of the tradition's origin. It is a small, mysterious tribute, perhaps to the victims, perhaps to the enduring power of the story itself. As with many historical horrors, the passage of time has dulled the immediate shock of the Crowell case. It has become one more dark chapter in Savannah's complex history, mentioned occasionally on specialized historical tours, but absent from the standard narratives presented to most visitors. The beautiful city shows its charming face to the world, while its shadows remain largely unexplored. Yet for those who know where to look, the evidence of Mary Ann's existence and her crimes remains embedded in the physical landscape of the city. The building where she conducted her experiments still stands. The false grave in Bonaventure Cemetery still bears her name. And somewhere, perhaps in a private collection, perhaps in an uncatalogued archive, perhaps lost forever, her journals continue to exist, testament to a mind that pursued knowledge without ethical constraints and viewed other human beings as nothing more than specimens for study. The most terrifying aspect of the Crowell mystery is not the gruesome details of what occurred in that cellar, but the fact that it could have happened at all, that a society could be structured in such a way that some lives were valued so little, their disappearance barely registered as a concern. It is a reminder that true horror resides not in supernatural phenomena, but in the capacity of human beings to detach completely from the humanity of others. As one historian wrote in a 2008 analysis of the case, Mary Ann Dupree Crowell was both an aberration and a logical extension of her time and place. Her actions were extreme even by the standards of a slave-holding society, yet they emerged from the same fundamental devaluation of black lives that made the institution of slavery possible. To dismiss her as merely a monster is to miss the more uncomfortable truth that monstrosity can emerge from systems we create and values we normalize. Today, the Savannah that tourists experience is a city of beauty and charm, its troubling past carefully curated and selectively presented. The carriage tours that traverse the historic district speak of architectural styles and romantic legends, rarely venturing into the darker realities that those elegant buildings witnessed. The ghost tours focus on ethereal apparitions rather than the tangible horrors of human history. But for those who seek a deeper understanding, the story of Mary Ann Dupree Crowell and the Crowell residents offers a window into a past that continues to shape our present, a reminder that history is not just what we choose to remember, but also what we have worked to forget. Perhaps the final word on the case belongs to Jacob Pearson, whose diary entry on the night before his death reads, "There is something in this house that defies comprehension, a darkness beyond ordinary human malice. I fear I have glimpsed only the surface of it, yet even that glimpse has been enough to convince me that some truths, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered." They remain with us, changing forever how we see the world around us. For those who have studied the Crowell case, Savannah's beautiful streets never look quite the same again. Behind every elegant facade lies the possibility of hidden chambers. Beneath every manicured garden, the potential for unmarked graves. It is a city of secrets, some still waiting to be revealed, others perhaps better left undisturbed.